Most people will tell you that the European conquest of Africa was an easy win because of guns and big ships. They want you to believe that the local kingdoms just stood there and watched as the colonial tide rolled over them. But there is a story they usually leave out of the history books. It's the story of a queen who saw the world's most powerful navy coming for her land and decided she wouldn't just fight them on the ground. She would beat them at their own game on the water. While the Portuguese were busy building massive galleons to cross the Atlantic, Queen Njinga was building something even more terrifying for them. A massive, silent, and deadly fleet of war canoes that turned the Kwanza River into a graveyard for invaders. When we think of naval legends, we often think of pirates in the Caribbean or admirals in the British Navy. But in the 17th century, the real master of naval strategy wasn't sitting in a palace in Lisbon or London. She was right there, in the heart of what is now Angola. Queen Njinga didn't just survive the Portuguese invasion, she led a 30-year war against them. And her secret weapon wasn't a secret at all, it was the river. She understood something the Portuguese didn't. She knew that if you control the water, you control the lifeblood of the country. By building Africa's largest pre-colonial fleet, she turned the Kwanza River into a liquid fortress that the Europeans simply couldn't crack. To understand why this navy was so important, you have to look at the map of 17th century West Central Africa. The kingdom of Ndongo was a powerful place, rich in culture and resources. But it had a massive problem. The Portuguese had arrived and they weren't there to trade beads and spices. They wanted people. They wanted to feed the growing demand for labor in their colonies in Brazil. To get those people, they needed to move deep into the interior of Africa. And the only highway that could take them there was the Kwanza River. The Portuguese thought they were the kings of the sea, and to be fair, their ships were huge. They had these massive wooden vessels bristling with cannons. On the open ocean, they were almost untouchable. But the Kwanza River is not the ocean. It's a winding, twisting, unpredictable beast. It's full of shallow spots, hidden sandbars, and thick clusters of reeds that can hide 1,000 men. The Portuguese tried to sail their heavy ships up the river, but they were slow, they got stuck, and they were incredibly easy to see coming. Njinga realized this early on. She saw that the Portuguese were relying on the river to move their soldiers, their food, and the people they had captured. If she could cut that line, she could starve them out. But she also knew that her land army, as brave as they were, had a hard time fighting against Portuguese muskets and stone forts. She needed a way to move her troops faster than the enemy could react. She needed to be everywhere at once. That's when she made the pivot that changed history. She decided that the kingdom of Ndongo wouldn't just be a land power, it would become a naval power. Building a navy from scratch in the middle of a war is not easy. It's not like she could just go to a shipyard and order a bunch of boats. She had to mobilize her entire society. She called on the finest woodworkers and artisans from across the kingdom. They went into the thick forests and began harvesting the hardest, most durable African hardwoods they could find. These weren't just little fishing boats. They were building war canoes, some of which were massive, long enough to carry 50, 60, or even more warriors at a time. Think about the engineering here. These boats had to be narrow enough to navigate through tight river bends, but stable enough that soldiers could stand up and fire arrows or throw spears without the whole thing tipping over. They didn't use nails like the Europeans did. They used traditional methods of carving and joining that actually made the boats more flexible and less likely to shatter if they hit a rock or a log in the water. Njinga didn't just build a few dozen boats. Contemporary reports from the time, including those from frustrated Portuguese officials, suggest she eventually commanded hundreds, and at her peak, thousands of these war canoes. Imagine standing on the bank of the river at dawn and seeing the mist clear, only to reveal a literal forest of oars moving toward you. It must have been a terrifying sight. She turned the Kwanza into a conveyor belt for her army. While the Portuguese were marching through the mud, getting bitten by insects and dying of tropical diseases, Njinga's marineros, her specialized river warriors, were gliding past them at 3 times the speed. One of the smartest things Njinga ever did was move her base of operations to the Kidonga Islands. These are a cluster of islands right in the middle of the Kwanza River. By doing this, she created what historians call a river fortress. If the Portuguese wanted to attack her, they couldn't just march their infantry up to her front door. They had to get into boats. And the moment they got into boats, they were in Njinga's world. Living on the islands meant she was always surrounded by water. Her fleet was parked right there, ready to go at a moment's notice. This gave her a level of mobility that the Europeans couldn't dream of. If a Portuguese patrol was spotted 10 miles downstream, her scouts would see them, paddle back to the islands, and within an hour, a strike force of 500 men would be on their way to intercept. The Portuguese tried everything to break her hold on the river. They tried building their own smaller boats, but they didn't know the currents. They didn't know where the deep channels were. They would constantly run aground, and the moment they did, Njinga's warriors would swarm them from the reeds. It was guerrilla warfare, but on the water. They would strike fast, sink the Portuguese supplies, and vanish back into the marshes before the heavy cannons could even be aimed. How do you fight a navy that you can't see? That was the nightmare the Portuguese governors in Luanda had to deal with every single day. Njinga's naval tactics were brilliant because they played to the strengths of the environment. One of her favorite moves was the ambush and disappear. Her warriors would paint their canoes with dark mud and cover them with branches and river grass. They would sit perfectly still in the inlets and tributaries, looking like nothing more than a clump of floating debris. The Portuguese would sail by in their transport boats thinking the river was empty. Then, suddenly, the debris would start moving. Hundreds of warriors would rise up, raining down arrows and fire. Before the Portuguese could even reload their muskets, the canoes would be gone, disappearing into shallow water where the European boats couldn't follow. Njinga also used her fleet as a pre-colonial radar system. She had a network of light, fast-moving scout canoes that patrolled the river 24/7. These scouts would use drums and smoke signals to send messages back and forth. She knew exactly what the Portuguese were doing days before they arrived. This intelligence network was so good that the Portuguese started to believe she had some kind of magical power. They couldn't understand how she was always one step ahead. But it wasn't magic. It was just incredible organization and the most efficient communication system in Africa at the time. We have to talk about the human side of this war. The main reason the Portuguese were there was to capture people. They had built these slave pens and warehouses along the river to hold men, women, and children before shipping them across the ocean. Njinga's navy wasn't just a military tool, it was a tool of liberation. She used her fleet to launch daring raids on these Portuguese outposts. Her boats would pull up in the middle of the night, her warriors would overwhelm the guards, and they would free the captives. But here's the really smart part. She didn't just send them home, she invited them to join her. Many of the people she freed were soldiers or skilled workers themselves. They would be integrated into her kingdom, and many of them became part of her marineros. By doing this, she was hitting the Portuguese where it hurt the most, their wallets. Every person she freed was a loss of profit for the colonial empire. She was literally dismantling the slave trade one boat at a time. This made her the #1 enemy of the Portuguese crown. They realized that as long as Njinga controlled the river, their entire colonial project in Angola was at risk of failing. There's one specific moment that really shows just how powerful her navy had become. The Portuguese finally got tired of being harassed and decided to launch a massive all-out assault on the Kidanga Islands. They gathered a huge force of soldiers, including their best European troops and thousands of local mercenaries. They spent months building a special fleet of flat-bottom boats designed specifically to handle the river. They thought they had her trapped. They moved up the river in a massive formation, confident that their superior firepower would win the day. But Njinga was waiting. She didn't meet them in the open water where their guns could reach her. Instead, she lured them deep into a section of the river where the current was tricky and the water was full of hidden obstacles. As the Portuguese fleet struggled against the current, Njinga's war canoes emerged from every side. It wasn't just a battle, it was a slaughter. Her warriors were expert swimmers and divers. They would jump out of their canoes, swim under the Portuguese boats, and use heavy tools to punch holes in the hulls. Imagine being a Portuguese soldier in heavy metal armor, feeling your boat start to sink in a river full of crocodiles, while arrows are flying at you from every direction. The Portuguese were forced into a disastrous retreat. They lost hundreds of men and almost all of their specialized boats. It was a humiliation that they would never forget, and it proved once and for all that Njinga was the undisputed admiral of the Kwanza. Njinga wasn't just a warrior, she was a world-class politician. She understood that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. At the time, the Dutch were also at war with the Portuguese. They wanted to take over the trade routes in the Atlantic. Njinga saw an opportunity. She sent her diplomats to talk to the Dutch West India Company. She proposed an alliance. She told the Dutch, "If you provide me with better weapons and naval support at the coast, I will make sure the Portuguese never get another person or another ounce of gold out of the interior." The Dutch were impressed. They had never met a leader like her. They agreed to the alliance, and for a while it was a game changer. With Dutch support, Njinga's navy became even more modern. She started getting access to better metal for weapons and even some European-style naval technology that she adapted for her river fleet. This was a nightmare scenario for the Portuguese. They weren't just fighting a local tribe anymore. They were fighting a sophisticated military alliance that had control over both the land and the water. This alliance allowed Njinga to keep the war going for decades. She was playing on a global stage, balancing the interests of European superpowers against each other to keep her people free. Control of the river wasn't just about fighting battles, it was about economics. Luanda, the main Portuguese city on the coast, was completely dependent on the interior for food. They needed corn, cattle, and other supplies to survive. Because Njinga controlled the Kwanza River, she could decide who got to eat and who didn't. She started a policy of total economic blockade. Her fleet would intercept any food shipments heading toward Luanda. She burned the fields of any local leaders who collaborated with the Portuguese. Pretty soon, the colonial capital was starving. The price of food skyrocketed, and the Portuguese soldiers started to desert because they weren't being fed or paid. This is the part of history people often miss. Wars aren't just won with swords, they are won with logistics. Njinga understood this better than almost anyone in the 17th century. By using her navy to choke the Portuguese economy, she forced them to realize that they could never truly conquer Ndongo. They could hold a few spots on the coast, but as long as she was the admiral of the Kwanza, they were just guests in her house, and very unwelcome guests at that. After 30 years of constant fighting, the Portuguese finally had enough. They had spent a fortune, lost thousands of lives, and they still hadn't defeated the Njinga, as they called her. They realized that they couldn't win a military victory against someone who was so dominant on the water and so loved by her people. In 1656, they did something they almost never did with African rulers. They sat down at a table and negotiated as equals. The resulting peace treaty was a massive win for Njinga. She was recognized as the legal ruler of Matamba and Ndongo. The Portuguese agreed to respect her borders, and, most importantly, they agreed to limit their activities on the river. Njinga had done the impossible. She had fought a European superpower for 3 decades and come out of it with her crown and her kingdom intact. And she did it because she had the vision to build a navy when everyone else was focusing on the land. She proved that African military innovation was just as advanced, if not more so, than what was coming out of Europe. Queen Njinga died in her 80s, still a legend, still a queen, and still undefeated. Her naval exploits are still remembered in Angola today. She isn't just a historical figure, she's a symbol of resistance and African power. When you look at the Kwanza River today, you're looking at the site of one of the greatest military achievements in human history. She didn't have a giant industrial base. She didn't have 1,000 years of naval tradition. She just had her brain, her people, and the river. She saw a problem, the colonial invasion, and she engineered a solution that the world's most powerful empire couldn't solve. Her war canoes were more than just boats. They were moving pieces of a master plan to keep Africa free. The story of Queen Njinga reminds us that history is full of people who refuse to accept the inevitable. They told her she couldn't beat the Portuguese. They told her she couldn't build a navy. She did both. And in doing so, she carved her name into the water of the Kwanza forever. If you want to see more stories about the hidden military history of Africa, make sure you watch this next video about the incredible warriors who changed the world.